this episode, we'll talk about Sarah and Hagar, the higher and the lower laws. Here we go. So in this episode, we're going to cover chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Galatians. And we'll just dip down again here in just a few of the scriptures that are offered up here and talk a little bit more about some of the things that we've talked about previously, because Paul he really brings out a lot of the themes that we've been talking about from the very beginning of the Gospels and kind of confirms what the Gospels had said and brings together the higher and the lower law, hierarchy. We've seen faith, hope, and charity. He talks about the Son of God here. And so that's where I'm going to start on this. In chapter 4 of Galatians, we see here in verse 4, "But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law." So again, this is what I've been trying to say the entire time, the entire year with the New Testament, about the title and the phrase, the Son of God. This is a title, and it means something different than what we might usually think of. We're used to having the Son of God kind of implied in maybe lessons, and maybe through our readings we infer this, that the Son of God means the Son of the Father. Well, of course that's true, but the reason we think of that is obviously the phrase, the Son of God, and then of course the Father is the one that introduces Jesus or Jehovah at his baptism and to Joseph Smith in the first vision. And so that's our reference point with the idea of the Son of God. However, that's not the way the Jews and the ancient Israelites thought of this. The Son of God is very specific and very important. Remember that through the Nehor principle, that the thought about God coming down to earth. So in the Old Testament, Jehovah, God, the God of the Old Testament, coming down to earth and receiving a body and taking on the sins of the world, that whole principle was lost over and over and over again. And we can see this principle playing out in the Book of Mormon. It wasn't completely lost, but there were several attempts at a coup of the gospel and the central point of the gospel, which is the Father sending his Son down to earth for the atonement, for the atoning sacrifice. So the key here in understanding what the Jews here would understand as the Son of God is to understand that the Jews at this time had lost the idea of the Son of God, which means Jehovah coming down and being born of Mary and receiving a body. That's what the Son of God means, not the Son of the Father, although he is. It means that he would come down and receive a body, be born of a woman, Mary, and physically be here through trials and tribulations and take on physically and spiritually the sins and sicknesses and sorrows and all negative things, all chaos of the world. And so when the Jews at this time had thought about, and in the time of the Gospels, had thought about the Messiah, they were not looking for that type of a Messiah, right? They were not looking for Jehovah, God, to be sent down from the Father. They were looking for a political leader who would be inspired, who would fight off the Romans at that time, or those from Antioch previous to that, or whoever else it might be in the past, of Assyria or Babylon, whoever else it might be. And so when they talk about, when Paul here is talking about the Son of God, there is this legacy for at least 600-700 years of what the Messiah was to the Jews that remained after the northern kingdom was conquered and the 10 tribes were carried away. And it was not what we know about the Messiah. Again, and I've gone over this before, but I'll say it again here, the thought that, the Jews are just still waiting for the Messiah and we believe that Jesus was the Messiah and that's the differences is not true. That doesn't jive. That doesn't make sense. The difference is we believe that Jesus was the Messiah and that Jesus was Jehovah, that he would come down and take on the sins of the world. So Paul, using the term here, he says it right here, God sent forth his Son. And then immediately after that, he says, made of a woman and made under the law. That means in mortality, in the lower law. He was born here into a lower law, into a temporal, physical, carnal law, into the temporal world that we all live in that has different rules than the spiritual world does. So that's important to understand. As they claim throughout the Gospels and use that title, especially John, the Son of God, they were saying something very specific that was against the theology and the beliefs, the doctrine of the Jews at the time. And this ties all the way back to Isaiah and their interpretation of Isaiah. That's why Jesus, when he announced who he was, right, through Isaiah in the synagogue, and that's why John the Baptist refers back to Isaiah, and so many refer back to Isaiah, because that understanding of what the Messiah was and who the Son of God was had been removed for many, many hundreds of years at that time. And they're trying to bring it back to an older tradition, an older theology that was the proper theology, of course. And that's how they're disrupting everything at this time. And that is what Paul is referring to. The Son of God means he's born into mortality of Mary. And then he ties this together in the following verse here. He says that he was made under the law, and to redeem them, in verse 5, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. So again, Christ is lowering himself from the spiritual world, right? Genesis 1:1, God made the heavens and the earth, and he came down to the lower earth and lowered himself to us. And of course, through the atonement, lowered himself below every single one of God's children. So he's lowering himself into the law of God, which is justice, and he is overcoming it so that we can all be adopted as sons, and this would be sons and daughters of God through his atonement. And then dipping down here to verse 18, he says, but it is good to be zealously affected always in a good thing. What does that remind you of? To me, it reminds me of Doctrine and Covenants section 58, verse 27, that says we should always be anxiously engaged in a good cause, right? Always trying to build up and support righteousness. This is all the same gospel. The Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price, the Book of Mormon, the New Testament and Old Testament. And then he does something really interesting here. He takes the idea again of Abraham. Remember, Abraham and Christ basically represent the higher law, the new covenant. And he says here in verse 22, for it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. So he's talking about bondage and freedom, and how we are all under bondage with the lower law, with the law of Moses, or the law of God, period, because of justice. We are bound, we are shackled because we cannot move beyond that without the higher law of Christ and of mercy and charity. And so Hagar, right, is representative of the bondwoman. That's who Abraham came out of Egypt with, who was given to him as a maidservant by Pharaoh. And when Sarah could not have a kid, then Abraham had a child with Hagar, who was Ishmael. And he says in verse 23, but he who was the bondwoman was born after the flesh, so without the covenant, the higher covenant. But he of the free woman was by promise. So there we get that idea again that we have just recently gone over, that the promise is the new covenant. Remember, we just talked about the oath and covenant of the priesthood. The oath is the promise of the higher law. So promise is exaltation. and the promised land and the glory of a family, of an eternal family. That is all under Abraham and Sarah. And he says exactly that here in verse 24 about this being an allegory. He says, which things are an allegory. For these are the two covenants, the one from the Mount Sinai, right? That's the one of Moses, the law of Moses that was brought down the second time, what they ended up with, which gendereth to bondage, which is Hagar or Hagar. Okay. And then 25, for this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children, because they don't have the higher law. 26, but Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. That would be the representative being Sarah. And remember, Jerusalem in all cities, but especially Jerusalem, is always viewed as the woman. We see that in the book of Revelation, right? We see that when she's righteous, she is wisdom, the city, right? Because it's kind of like a vessel, and vessels are always women because they're the ones that carry the future. They're the ones that carry a baby. So a boat, a building, typically these are always named after women. And a city carries all of the people that live in it. And when Jerusalem is wicked, then that woman is a harlot or a sinner of some sort, breaking the covenant, which would be represented by marriage. And so looking at this allegory that Paul is putting forth here, we have Ishmael from Hagar and Isaac from Sarah. We see the difference here where there was a bond made, that is law and justice, and a free woman, which is Sarah, who, along with Abraham, had to wait and trust and have faith in having the right heir and having Isaac. And that is the way they looked at that, right? That is the higher covenant. You see Paul oftentimes referring to works as part of the lower law and faith as part of the higher law. So Abraham is of faith because he and Sarah, they waited. They had to trust in the Lord to produce the heir and to produce the promised land and all the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant. And you can even look at the house of Abraham, where eventually Sarah, the mother of the promised child, ends up booting Hagar and Ishmael out of the home. And so allegorically, we can see that as the promise, the faith, overcoming the law and justice and the shackles of the lower law. That's allegorically speaking, of course. And he caps that off here, that thought here, that allegory in verse 30 exactly with that. He says, nevertheless, what saith the Scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. In other words, the lower law does not have the promise. It does not give us the hope in the future. We can't grow and progress and get to where we need to be through works alone, through our merit alone. That's what that represents. And then here in chapter 5, he kind of goes over that again, referencing the people here of Galatia. And he says, Christ has become of no effect unto you. In other words, you've had the gospel, you have the higher law. You have the ability now to have faith in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. But whosoever of you are justified by the law, you think that you're justified again means complete. You're going to get where you need to be in the afterlife. You're righteous. Those of you who are justified by the law or think that you are, ye are fallen from grace, which is what the higher law is, right? The grace is the power of God that comes through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And then he talks about our agency, because that is paramount in the plan of salvation. And how, look, I mean, you've got the choice now of the higher law or the lower law. You can live just by the lower law, as the Jewish ancestors have done for a very long time. Or you can pick the higher law. You have that agency. He says here in Verse 13, for, brethren, ye have been called unto liberty. Liberty is the higher law, because Christ frees us for our progression. Only use not liberty, or your agency, for an occasion to the flesh. In other words, look, Adam and Eve, that's you. You have the two trees here. You have now, you can see the tree of life here. You can see the tree of knowledge of good and evil. One of them is works and justice. One of them is love and mercy. You need both. But if you are just choosing this over here, and you do not accept the higher law, you do not accept the tree of life, then you're using that agency, which is important, but you're using that agency for something lower. And he's trying to say, look, choose the high road, so to speak, right? Don't choose the low road. Choose the high road here and the tree of life. And in verse 14, for all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And that is what Christ did. And that is how he epitomizes that phrase, right? Love thy neighbor as thyself through his sacrifice and through his example, through his miracles. And he fulfilled the law because of what he did. And we're supposed to do the same thing. So it's not just a matter of, okay, Christ has done this now, and I will have faith in the atonement. It's a matter of us also, apart from repentance and hope that we have, it is charity, right? Faith, hope, and charity, which charity is the highest, which is love your neighbor as yourself. So we also have to follow the example of the sacrifice of Jesus, not just rely on his sacrifice. And then he goes through and he makes comparisons of what the fruit of the lower law is alone and what the fruit of the higher law is. And it's all the negative things, all the sins of the lower law. And then of the higher law, he says the fruits are love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law, or the lower law. And they that are Christ have crucified the flesh. We've killed off the natural man, is probably a better way to put that, because they're talking about the flesh. We have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. And that means everything, right? That is not just promiscuity or the lust, the sexual drive. That is all of the wants and needs and emotions and everything that this body generates that is not touched by the Spirit. All of our passions, all of our bad habits, laziness, diet, addictions, emotional issues, things that are pulling us back or holding us down with the body. And then in chapter 6, he talks about this charity and this love of the higher law. He says in verse 1, brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. So don't fall for what somebody else is doing, but help that person that has been overtaken with this mistake. It's not for us to judge that person. It's for us to help that person. And then we get this that we also read in Alma, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. It is interesting that in Hebrew, the same word for forgiveness means to bear, like in bearing somebody else's burdens. That's a part of that dynamic of forgiveness. In a sense, we kind of take that person's burden on to ourselves. It's not just a matter of service. It's sympathy. It's being empathetic to that person and carrying that burden with them. That's part of forgiveness. And then he starts talking again about agency, but indirectly. And he talks about the fruits of our decisions. And he says here in verse 4, let every man prove his own work, and then shall he have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. And that's an important thing. Eventually, right, we need to make our own decisions and live with those decisions, hopefully good ones. But we're also going to live with our bad decisions. And that agency comes along with the consequences that go with those choices, good or bad. In verse 7, be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. So there are laws that are in place. There are spiritual laws that are in place. That doesn't mean we don't have bad things that happen to us that have nothing to do with our agency. That's part of the law here on earth as well. But what we sow, we're going to reap as well. There are responses to those decisions that are kind of set already for us as laws. So which consequences do we want? The good ones or the bad ones? I can just see my parents listening to this and saying, yeah, Greg, we tried to tell you that when you were a kid, you know? I mean, which consequences do you want? Which decisions are you going to make? Probably still do. And then I'm going to finalize this episode with verse 9 here, where he goes back again to what we talked about being zealous in your work. He says, and let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. So again, don't tire of doing good. Be zealous in being productive for goodness sake. That's our job. When you have the knowledge where much is given, much is required, and much is expected. So if you have the fullness of the gospel in your life and you have this understanding, then don't be weary in producing goodness and righteousness. And that, I think he's trying to say here, this is part of the key of not falling back down into the flesh or into a lower law. You need to be productive, and you need to live a life where you are creating righteousness along with the Savior, and not just relying on him through your faith and having that hope through his sacrifice, but having charity for those around us, just like he did. I'll talk to you next time.